Recognize that solids, liquids, and gases can be described by color. Recognize that the texture of an object is observed by touch. Recognize that temperature is the amount of heat in an object, is measured with a thermometer, and is recorded as degrees Celsius. Recognize that solids, liquids, and gases can be described by color. When observing objects and materials, we can use our senses to provide descriptions. Here are 3 glass containers. Number 1 contains a solid, number 2 a liquid, and number 3 a gas, air. First, let's observe the color of each of the 3. All 3 are colorless. They have no color. Here is an example of a solid which we can describe as red in color. Here is an example of a liquid which can be described as blue in color. The only gas that we're going to observe in 5th grade is air, and air is always colorless. Next, let's observe how each object and material handles light. When I hold up this solid, I can see through it. Light travels through the object, and I can see the objects on the other side. This object is transparent. Here's another solid. Looking through this solid, I observe light coming through the object, but I cannot see objects on the other side. This object is translucent. The third object blocks all light. I cannot observe anything through this object. This object is opaque. Observing the liquid, we can observe that it is transparent. We can see clearly through the liquid. Here is an example of a liquid that is translucent. Light passes through it, but we can't clearly see through the liquid. Here is an example of an opaque liquid, crude oil. Light does not pass through this oil at all. Finally, we observe that air is transparent. Remember, the only gas that we are really going to study in 5th grade is air. Air is actually a mixture of gases. Air is mostly nitrogen. There is also oxygen and carbon dioxide in the air. This is important to remember when studying plants and animals. Air also contains water vapor. Water vapor in the air is always an invisible gas. Water vapor is made up of individual molecules or particles of water. It is easy to confuse things like clouds, fog, and steam as water vapor. These are not water vapor. Each of these are made up of condensed droplets of water floating in the air. That's a lot of information about color and light. You don't really need to remember transparent, translucent, and opaque. Just be familiar with those terms. When studying minerals, those are one way to identify one mineral from another. Recognize that the texture of an object is observed by touch. Recognize that temperature is the amount of heat in an object, is measured with a thermometer, and is recorded as degrees Celsius. We can observe solids, liquids, and gases using our sense of touch. First, we can observe the texture of an object. Objects might be described as smooth, rough, glassy. These words describe the texture of an object or material, how it feels against our skin. We can compare objects based on texture. Some objects might be more or less rough than other objects. Sandpaper, which is rough to the touch, is actually categorized by roughness. Number 60 sandpaper is rougher than number 100, and number 100 is rougher than number 400, and so on. This sample of number 2000 sandpaper actually feels smooth to the touch, but it still has grit. Another property of objects that we can observe with our sense of touch is temperature. We are used to describing objects and materials using words like warm and cool, hot, cold. These words are familiar words, and they are certainly okay to use in science, but they are actually opinions. What feels warm to me might feel hot to you. In general, though, we can kind of agree on descriptions like warm to the touch or cool to the touch. To be more precise, we need to provide accurate measurement for temperatures. Thermometers can do that. There are two basic kinds of thermometers we can use: tube thermometers and digital thermometers. Let's look at tube thermometers first. These thermometers are filled with a liquid that will expand, get larger, with heat. Left sitting on my table for a long time, this thermometer has come to what we call room temperature, somewhere around 75 degrees Fahrenheit. To measure the temperature of this sample of liquid, I simply put the thermometer into the liquid and give it a minute or two to finish expanding. Once the liquid in the tube has stopped moving, I can read and record the temperature. In science, we record temperature in degrees Celsius. Tube thermometers are the easiest to use and measure the temperature of liquids and the air. Digital thermometers are useful to measure the surface temperature of solid objects. For example, we can use a digital thermometer to measure the temperature of the sidewalk in the sunlight and in the shade. Remember, it's okay to use terms like cool to the touch to describe temperature. Start practicing measuring the precise temperature of liquids. Instead of saying mix with warm water, say mix with water at 50 degrees Celsius. Also, remember to be careful about using Fahrenheit and Celsius scales.